Cordelia Vale had been awake so long that the candles in the Hall of Reckonings seemed to breathe. Their flames bent and straightened with the draft that slid beneath the cathedral doors, and every time the light shifted, the carved faces of dead kings above the dais looked different, stern one moment, hungry the next. She stood below them in her widow's black, her son pressed to her chest beneath a wool cloak gone thin at the seams, and felt every eye in the chamber resting not on her grief, but on her worth. The infant slept despite the noise. His small cheek lay against her collarbone, warm and trusting. His fist had closed around a fold of her gown and held it as if even in dreams he feared being taken from her. On the stone floor below the tribunal, a silver chain had been laid in a circle. Debtors stood inside it, criminals, the ruined. Cordelia stood within it now. "The estate of Elias Vale is forfeit," intoned the herald, his voice carrying through the vaulted dark. His widow, Cordelia Vale, and the male child born of his line are to be transferred by covenant sale in settlement of blood debt. A murmur passed through the nobles gathered in the gallery. She kept her face still. It was the last pride left to her. Her husband had been dead only 6 weeks, buried beneath frozen earth with no proper mourning, because his creditors had come before the priest. They had seized the house, the books, the silver candelabra from her mother's side, even the cradle linen. Then they had found the old bond her husband's father had signed to the Night Court years ago, and because mortal debts mattered more in vampire dominions than mortal sorrow. Cordelia and her child had been brought here like livestock. The man bidding first was Lord Garrick Sable, broad-handed, perfumed, and smiling in a way that made her skin turn cold. "For the widow and the babe," he said lazily, "3 gold sigils and transport rights." Laughter rose soft as dust. Someone else added, "The babe has a strong pair of lungs." "He'll survive winter." Another voice, female and amused, "The widow's face may raise the price." Cordelia looked at no one. She had learned in the 6 weeks since Elia's death that humiliation grew teeth when fed by witness. Her son stirred. She bent her head, pressing her mouth to his hair once. Milk and lavender. The last clean scent in the room. "4 sigils," said Garrick. "5," came another. She tightened her hold until her arm trembled. No one was stopping this. No priest, no magistrate. No old friend of her husband's. Not one of the women who had once praised her manners and asked to see the baby's christening lace. The herald lifted his staff. 5 sigils for the widow and her son. The doors of the hall opened. Not with violence, not with haste. They opened as though darkness itself had decided to enter. Every candle guttered lower. The draft that followed carried winter and iron, and something older than both. The nobles fell silent so swiftly that the herald's next word died in his throat. Cordelia looked up because everyone else did. He stood at the threshold in a long black coat clasped at the throat with a silver seal shaped like a thorned crown. He wore no jewels besides it. None were needed. Authority moved before him like a tide. Tall, grave, and still, King Valerian of the Night Dominion descended the center aisle without escort, his face pale as carved stone beneath the cathedral lamps. Cordelia had seen him only once before, at a distance, riding through the capital at dusk while people bowed from the roadside. He had seemed then like a rumor with a body. Now he seemed less human than the shadows around him, and yet more alive than anyone in the chamber. He stopped at the edge of the silver chain. No one spoke until the high adjudicator managed, "Your Majesty, this is a private debt settling." Valerian's gaze did not shift toward the man. It remained on Cordelia. She had not expected the king's eyes to be so dark, not red, not monstrous, simply dark enough to suggest depth without mercy. Then his gaze lowered to the child in her arms. Something changed in his face, not softness, never that, recognition. "What is the child's age?" he asked. The question, quiet as it was, made half the chamber lean forward. Cordelia answered because no one else had the right. 3 months, sire." Her own voice startled her. It did not shake. The king's eyes returned to hers. "His name, Lucian." The baby opened his eyes as if called. wide gray, still clouded by infancy. He looked at the vampire king and did not cry. The silence thickened. Lord Garrick cleared his throat. "Your Majesty, if this pleases you, I will yield the child after lawful purchase. The widow as well, provided—" "Be silent." Valerian did not raise his voice. He did not need to. Garrick went white. The king stepped over the silver chain. Gasps rippled through the hall. A crowned vampire was not meant to cross into debtor's law. Mortal ruin was beneath the throne. Yet he did it without hesitation, and the silver did not touch him. It blackened where his boot passed, as though unable to hold its own shape in his presence. Cordelia's pulse struck once, hard. Valerian stopped close enough that she saw the faint scar at his temple, the old, white line disappearing into his dark hair. He smelled of winter halls, extinguished candles, and rain on stone. Then he lifted one gloved hand and touched the edge of Lucian's blanket with a single finger. The baby gave a small, startled breath. The king looked toward the tribunal at last. "Under the 9th covenant," he said, "I invoke royal protection upon the widow Cordelia Vale and her son." Shock moved through the chamber like a knife through silk. The adjudicator rose halfway from his seat. "Your Majesty, the 9th covenant is reserved for bloodline threat, succession matter, or sacred inheritance." "Yes," said Valerian. Cordelia felt the word before she understood it. Someone in the gallery whispered, "No." Someone else said, "Impossible." Garrick Sable found his courage again. "If there is sacred inheritance, then the council must examine the child. The claim cannot be made in secrecy." Valerian turned his head, only that. Garrick fell silent as if his throat had closed around invisible hands. Then the king said, for all of them to hear, "The widow and the child are mine to protect, not mine to possess. Not mine to buy, mine to protect." Yet the word mine struck the chamber like thunder. Cordelia's face burned. She had never felt more exposed. Claimed before nobles, judges, carrion men with ledgers. Claimed with her son in her arms, as though her life had become a decree spoken by someone who could unmake kingdoms. She should have felt only fear. Instead, beneath the humiliation, something stranger moved, something perilously close to relief. Valerian removed the signet ring from his hand and gave it to the herald. "The debt is extinguished from the royal treasury." He looked at Cordelia again. "Come." It was not tender. It was not cruel. It was simply a command shaped by certainty. Cordelia did not move. "Why?" she asked. Around them, the room seemed to stop breathing. No one questioned the vampire king. No ruined widow certainly did not, but Valerian answered. His gaze dropped once more to Lucian, and the darkness in his expression deepened into something like dread. "Because if I had come 1 minute later," he said, "your son would already be dead." The cathedral bells began to ring, not from human hands. From the tower above, a warning peal shattered the night, and outside the closed doors, something screamed. As the warning bells thundered, Cordelia realized the king had not rescued her from disgrace alone. He had come because something in her child had awakened. And something monstrous had come hunting for it. Blackthorn Palace rose above the river like a mausoleum built for a god who had refused burial. Its towers cut into the night sky in iron angles. No lamps burned in the upper windows. Only the lower galleries held candlelight, and even that light seemed subdued, as if the house preferred dimness the way other dwellings preferred air. Cordelia crossed its threshold with Lucian in her arms and the memory of cathedral bells still lodged behind her ribs. She had not spoken during the journey. Neither had the king. The carriage had moved through shuttered streets under armed escort, while the city whispered itself awake in fear. Once, when Lucian stirred and began to whimper, Cordelia had tried to soothe him quietly, ashamed to let the sound fill the enclosed dark. Before she could calm him, Valerian had spoken from the opposite seat. "Draw the curtain back from the left side." She obeyed without understanding. Moonlight entered in a pale silver wash. Lucian settled at once. That had been the only kindness of the ride, and because it had come without gentleness, it troubled her more than comfort might have done. Now servants in black livery bowed as she passed, but their eyes lingered. Not insolent, not warm, Curious, wary, almost reverent when they glanced at the child. No one tried to take him from her. That, more than anything, made Cordelia suspicious. A woman of severe bearing approached in the entrance hall. She was vampire pale, old in the manner of carved ivory rather than flesh, her silver hair drawn back under a jet comb. "I am Mistress Ianthe," she said. "I keep the inner household." Cordelia inclined her head. "My thanks. Do not thank me yet." It was not rude, it was practical. Mistress Ianthe led her through corridors draped in dark velvet and lined with portraits whose eyes seemed too alive. At the end of the eastern wing, she opened a door into a suite of rooms large enough to shame a noble house. A chamber with a canopied bed, a nursery already prepared, a fire burning low, fresh linen, warm water, and a cradle of black ash wood carved with thorns and lilies. Cordelia stopped on the threshold. "This was readied before tonight," she said. Mistress Ianthe did not deny it. "Yes, for whom?" "For you." Cordelia looked down at Lucian as if the answer might be hidden in the curve of his cheek. The older woman's voice softened by 1 degree. "You may sleep while the child sleeps. Food will be sent. If you require milk, broth, or linens, ring once. If there is danger, ring 3 times. Cordelia's head came up. "Danger from whom?" Mistress Ianthe met her gaze. "If I knew that yet, you would not need to ask." And then she left. Cordelia set Lucian in the cradle with painful care, as if the room might vanish should she move too quickly. The child made a small sound but did not wake. The fire clicked. Wind touched the glass. She should have slept. Instead, she crossed to the nursery window. From here she could see the palace courtyard, and beyond its iron gates, the black ribbon of the river. Guards stood at every entrance, cloaks unmoving in the cold. This was not hospitality, it was fortification. Behind her, a quiet voice said, "You should not stand in the draught." She turned so sharply her hand caught on the window latch. Valerian stood in the open doorway. No servant had announced him. No step had betrayed him. He had removed his coat. In the low firelight he seemed leaner, less monumental, yet not less dangerous. His white shirt was unadorned. The dark vest over it bore the royal seal embroidered in black thread that only caught the light when he moved. Cordelia gathered herself. "Forgive me, sire." "I did not hear you." "That is often the case." He looked past her to the cradle. His expression changed by an inch. She had begun to understand that an inch was all he ever gave. "Why is my son in danger?" she asked. Valerian came no farther into the room, whether from restraint or instinct she could not tell. "Something marked him tonight. At the tribunal? No. Earlier?" She thought of Lucian's sudden waking at the cathedral, of the bells, the scream outside. "Then why claim us publicly?" "Because secrecy would have killed him by morning." That answer, though true, did not satisfy her. "And me?" His gaze rested on her face with unnerving steadiness. "You were not separable from the matter." It should not have wounded her. After all, he spoke like a king, not a lover or friend. Yet something in the cold precision of it made her fingers curl against her sleeves. She heard herself ask, "Am I a burden to your protection then?" For the first time, an unreadable flicker crossed his features. "No," one word, immediate. It unsettled her more than distance had done. Lucian stirred in the cradle and gave a soft, drowsy cry. Cordelia was already moving, but Valerian had taken 1 step forward before stopping himself so abruptly it seemed pain had checked him. She lifted the baby. Lucian blinked, stared over her shoulder, and reached a tiny hand into the air toward the king. The room went very still. Cordelia turned. Valerian had not moved. Yet his gaze was fixed on the child's outstretched fingers with an intensity that felt almost like grief. "He does not do that with strangers," she said before she could stop herself. Valerian's voice was lower when he answered. "I am not certain I am strange to him." The words made no sense. Or rather, they made too much sense in a way she could not yet bear to examine. Lucian whimpered. Cordelia rocked him gently. The king looked toward the fire, then the windows, then the shadows gathered in the corners of the room, as if measuring every entrance death might choose. "Do not leave the eastern wing after midnight. If you hear anyone call your name from the corridor, Do not answer unless the voice belongs to Mistress Ianthe or to me." Cold moved beneath Cordelia's skin. "What is in this house? Nothing that wishes you well." He turned to go. "Your Majesty," he paused. She had not meant to speak again, but the question rose from some bruised place deeper than fear. "When you said before everyone that we were yours to protect, was that only law?" He looked back at her. For one suspended instant, the room seemed built entirely of silence. Then he said, "Law is the smallest part of what binds the living to the dead." And before she could ask what he meant, the nursery fire went out all at once. In the dark, Lucien began to scream. Something moved behind the cradle. When the fire died, Cordelia saw a shape unfolding from the nursery shadows. Not servant, not thief, but something long-fingered and eyeless that had been waiting beside her son. Cordelia did not scream. Fear rose through her body like ice water, but years of being taught silence under pressure held. She clutched Lucien to her breast and stumbled backward as the shape behind the cradle lifted itself from the dark in a ripple of thin limbs and glistening, blind flesh. Its mouth opened where a face should have been. Valerian was already between them. Cordelia never saw him cross the room. One instant he stood by the door, the next his hand was around the creature's throat. It writhed, lengthening obscenely, its claws striking sparks from the hearthstones where the fire had died. A smell of grave earth and old blood filled the nursery. "Look away," he said. She did not, she could not. Not while Lucien cried against her throat and the thing reached toward him with desperate hunger. Valerian's grip tightened. The creature convulsed. Then the king drove it backward into the cradle. The ashwood frame split. No blade flashed. No incantation was spoken. Only silence, pressure, impossible strength, and the creature collapsed inward as if crushed by invisible hands. Black fluid seeped over the broken cradle rails. The air screamed once in a pitch beyond hearing, then emptied. The dark withdrew. The nursery lamps rekindled with a hiss. Cordelia's knees weakened. She remained standing only because terror had locked her body upright. Valerian turned at once, not toward the ruin on the floor, but toward her and the child. "Has it touched him?" "No, your skin." "No." He came one step closer. "Let me see." Every instinct in her recoiled. Yet the urgency in his voice had nothing of possession in it, only dread. With trembling hands, she shifted Lucien's blanket back from his face. The baby's cries had softened to hiccuping sobs. Valerian bent, close enough that Cordelia felt cold air gather around him, and examined Lucien's brow, his throat, his tiny fists. Then his gaze lifted to hers. "You are bleeding." Only then did she feel the sting at her wrist. Glass from the shattered window latch, or perhaps splintered ash from the cradle, had opened a narrow cut across the pale underside of her hand. A bright line of blood ran toward her palm. Valerian's stare fixed on it too long. Not hungrily, not exactly, but something older and harsher moved beneath his restraint, and Cordelia saw the effort it cost him to look away. "Ianthe," he called. The door opened at once. The mistress of the house entered with 2 guards behind her, took in the scene without visible surprise, and signaled for the broken cradle to be removed. "A grave wraith inside the eastern wing," she said. "Someone invited it." Valerian did not answer. His gaze had returned to Cordelia's wrist despite himself. She drew the hand against her skirts. At once his jaw hardened, as though her concealment had struck him in some private place. "I will send a physician," said Ianthe. "No," Valerian said. "No physician." He held out his hand to Cordelia. "Come." She looked at the ruin on the floor, the black stains spreading where the creature had died. "Where? To the chapel. I should stay with my son. He comes with us." That was how she found herself in the palace chapel at an hour when mortal churches slept. It was no comforting place. No painted saints softened its walls. Black marble rose in pillars striped with pale veins like old scars, and the altar was cut from a single block of moonstone that gave back light without warmth. Yet the room felt cleaner than the rest of the palace, as if violence could enter only at cost. Lucien had gone drowsy from crying. He lay in Cordelia's arms while Valerian lit 3 silver candles and set them on the altar. Then he turned to her. "Show me the wound," she obeyed. "A bad idea," some part of her whispered. Not because he would harm her, but because he might not. Because she had already begun to believe in the shape of his protection, and belief was more dangerous than fear. He took her wrist with gloved fingers. The contact was brief and exact. Still, it moved through her body with unsettling force. His hand was colder than hers, but steady enough to quiet the tremor in her own. "This is not from glass," he said. Cordelia looked down. The cut had changed. It was no longer a thin, accidental line. The edges were darkening in a pattern like two small crescents facing one another. Her breath caught. "The wraith tasted the air before it died," Valerian said. "It marked the blood it came for. My blood, not only yours." She felt Lucian shift against her. "You said someone invited it." "Yes. Who? I do not yet know." The king released her wrist and removed one glove, revealing a hand pale enough to seem luminous in the candlelight. The veins faint blue beneath the skin. Without warning, he drew a nail across his own thumb. Cordelia flinched. A bead of dark blood welled instantly. "What are you doing? Sealing the mark before it calls another." He said it as if there were no alternative. Perhaps there was not. Still, she did not move. "Will it hurt?" "Yes," he said. The honesty of it steadied her more than reassurance could have done. He touched his bleeding thumb to the crescent wound on her wrist. Pain flashed through her, not burning, but plunging, as though cold had entered the bone. She gasped and would have pulled away if his other hand had not closed gently but immovably around her forearm. Then the pain broke open into vision. A ruined hall, snow at the windows, a younger Valerian kneeling beside a woman in white, blood blooming over her throat, her hand against his face. His silence like a wound too deep for sound. The vision shifted. Cordelia saw herself as a child, standing in her mother's room while rain beat the shutters. Her mother, fever-bright, pressed a ring of black silver into her tiny palm and whispered, "If anyone ever comes for your blood, run from priests and lords alike. Only the crowned dead may keep you." Cordelia staggered. Valerian caught her before she fell. For one suspended moment she was against him, the iron line of his body, the terrible care in his stillness, the scent of winter and ashes. Lucian slept between them, untouched. Then Valerian let her go as if contact itself endangered them both. The mark on her wrist had sealed into a silvered scar. Cordelia looked up, breathless. "What did I see?" His expression had become unreadable again, but strain shadowed it. "Blood remembers what the living are not told. My mother knew you. She knew what hunted her line." Cordelia's mouth went dry. "And my son," Valerian's gaze shifted to the sleeping child. When he answered, his voice was quieter than before. "Your son has inherited a door in the blood." Tonight, something on the other side opened its eyes. A bell began to ring somewhere deep beneath the palace. Not alarm, summons. Valerian's face went still as carved midnight. "The council moves faster than I expected," he said. And when Cordelia looked down, she saw that Lucian's small fist had closed around the king's wounded thumb and would not let go. The blood mark on Cordelia's wrist had awakened ancestral memory. And beneath the palace, the vampire council had already convened, because Lucian's blood had revealed something the throne had feared for centuries. By morning, nothing in Blackthorn Palace pretended to be ordinary. Servants spoke in lower voices. Guards stood inside doorways where before they had patrolled the outer halls. Mistress Ianthe ordered 2 new cradles brought and rejected them both, choosing instead to place Lucian beside Cordelia's bed in a traveling bassinet lined with consecrated silver thread. No one explained why. No one needed to. Cordelia understood now that the danger in the palace had not come from accident. It had come because something in her child was worth risking sacrilege to reach. She had not slept after the chapel. Each time she closed her eyes, she saw the vision summoned by Valerian's blood. The dead woman in white, the secret ring in her mother's hand, the warning only the crowned dead may keep you. It had not felt like dream, it had felt like inheritance. At noon, Valerian sent for her. She found him not in a throne room, but in the old library, where light filtered through high stained glass in dark jewel tones, and no fire burned despite the cold. Shelves climbed toward shadow, crowded with volumes bound in leather gone almost black with age. At the far end, before a table strewn with maps and sealed documents, the king stood with one hand braced against the carved wood. He looked as if he had not moved since dawn. Cordelia paused in the doorway with Lucian in her arms. "You sent for me, sire." Valerian turned. For one brief instant she thought fatigue had softened him. Then the expression vanished, and he was once more composed into that grave stillness he wore like armor. "I have had the archives opened," he said. "Your mother's family appears nowhere under their married names." Cordelia crossed the room. "Then how did you find us?" "I did not find you," he said. "Your son did." She tightened her hold on Lucian. Valerian took up a single parchment from the table and slid it toward her. It was old enough for the edges to powder under careless touch. A crest had been drawn at the top, a lily threaded through a thorned crown. Her breath stopped. That crest had been inside the black silver ring her mother kept hidden. "This belonged to House Marrow," said Valerian. "A mortal line once kept under royal protection. Their blood retained memory after death. Faces, names, betrayals. Things courts kill to bury." Cordelia heard the care with which he withheld larger explanations. It was almost a mercy. "And Lucian bears this blood?" "Yes, from me." "Yes." She looked down at her sleeping child. He seemed too soft, too small, too human for ancient danger. "Why would anyone want him?" she whispered. Valerian's gaze darkened. "Because memory is power. Because there are those on my council who would kill for the past to remain buried. And because there are hunters outside these walls who would rather burn a cradle than allow such blood to survive." She lifted her head sharply. "Hunters, do not fear the word less because men wield it in the name of God." Something in his voice, old bitterness, old knowledge, made her study him anew. Valerian had the stillness of a ruler, yes, but beneath it she sensed a lifetime of restraint forged against violence. Not conquest, endurance. "Was my husband killed for this?" she asked. The question hung between them like a blade. Valerian did not answer at once. That was answer enough. Cordelia's knees nearly failed her. She set Lucian down in a padded chair beside the table before her hands betrayed her. "Elias knew." "Not fully," Valerian said. "He found correspondence." He was silenced before he could understand it. For a moment the library vanished behind a white rush of grief. Elias had not been a grand man, nor a strong one. He had been earnest, scholarly, too trusting, and sometimes foolish in money. But he had been kind to their son. He had kissed Cordelia's forehead at night as if gratitude lived there. To know he had died not of misfortune, not of ordinary human fragility, but because others had measured her child against power. She gripped the edge of the table until her knuckles whitened. Valerian watched her, unmoving. At last he said, more quietly, "You may hate me if it steadies you. I knew the old bloodline had not ended." "I did not know it lived in your house until last night." Cordelia turned to him. "And if you had known?" His answer came without pause. "I would have taken you sooner." The honesty of it struck harder than gentleness would have. She should have recoiled. Instead, she heard the terrible shape of the truth inside the words. Not desire, not conquest, but a king admitting he would have uprooted her life to keep her alive. Lucian stirred and gave a weak, fretful cry. Cordelia went to him at once, but when she touched his brow, fear turned her blood cold. He was fever-warm. "Valerian!" The king was beside her instantly. Lucian whimpered in sleep. Beneath the child's skin, for one impossible instant, Cordelia thought she saw a flicker like silver lightning move through the veins at his temples. Valerian's face hardened. "The blood is opening too quickly." "What does that mean?" "It means memory is trying to wake in an infant body." "Can you stop it?" A pause. Then, not entirely. Lucian's tiny fingers clenched, and his mouth opened in a soundless cry. Cordelia felt helpless panic tear through her restraint. "Do something." Valerian lifted the child with astonishing care. His large, pale hand almost covered Lucian's entire back, then he bit into his own wrist. Cordelia stared, not savagery, not spectacle. A single precise breach, deliberate as sacrament, dark blood welled. Valerian touched it to Lucian's lips. The child swallowed once. At once the fever broke. Cordelia swayed, shock and relief fighting inside her. "What have you done? Royal blood can quiet the awakening. Will it bind him to you?" The question came from fear, but it landed like accusation. Valerian did not defend himself. He only looked at Lucian sleeping peacefully against his shoulder and said, "Everything I do binds someone to me. That is the burden of a crown." Then he returned the child to her arms, carefully, almost reverently. On his wrist, the wound had not yet closed. A drop of blood slid down his hand and fell onto Cordelia's sleeve. Her silvered scar burned. Far below, the palace bell sounded 3 times. Mistress Ianthe appeared at the library doors, her face sharpened by urgency. "Your Majesty, the council has invoked formal challenge. They demand to see the child before moonrise." Valerian did not turn. "They may demand," he said. "They will not have him." But when Cordelia looked up at him, she understood from the absolute stillness in his face that the night ahead would not be contained within these walls. To save Lucian, Valerian had fed him royal blood, an act that could protect the child or doom them both once the council learned of it. The chamber beneath the old West Tower had once been a schoolroom. Cordelia could tell by the faded frescoes hidden under darker paint. Stars, letters, branches of some long-cut family tree. Now the room served as a refuge. Only Mistress Ianthe, 2 trusted guards, and the king knew she was there with Lucian while the council assembled elsewhere in the palace to argue over law and blood. The air smelled faintly of dust and cedar. A storm had come in from the river, and rain struck the narrow windows in small, relentless taps. Lucian slept in her lap, exhausted by fever. Cordelia sat beside the hearth with a shawl around her shoulders and the black-silver ring in her palm. Valerian had given it to her at dusk. "I found it in the sealed archives," he had said. "It belongs to your line." She had nearly dropped it. The ring was identical to the one she remembered from childhood, down to the tiny thorn crown worked around the inner band. Her mother's had vanished after her burial. Cordelia had thought some servant or creditor took it. Now she suspected her mother had hidden more than one thing. She turned the ring slowly in the firelight. On the inside, almost too faint to see, one line had been engraved. "When memory wakes, choose the hand that shields, not the hand that owns." A sound at the door drew her up so sharply that Lucian stirred. Valerian entered without escort. He closed the door behind him and remained with one shoulder against the wood, as if giving her distance were an effort consciously made. There was damp on his hair and a tear in the black sleeve near his left shoulder, though no blood showed. "You have been injured," Cordelia said. "It is nothing. You say that as if pain obeys rank." A strange look passed through his eyes, not amusement, something quieter. "No. It obeys necessity." He crossed the room at last, but only to stand near the hearth. Firelight cut his face into planes of gold and shadow. His presence changed the room's shape. Every space near him felt more deliberate. "Has the council yielded?" she asked. "For tonight?" That meant no. Cordelia knew enough now to hear the weight under such answers. "What have they accused me of?" He did not soften it. "Entrapment, concealment of sacred blood, corruption of the heirless throne." She stared at him. "Heirless?" Valerian went still. The memory from the chapel surged back to her, the woman in white dying in his arms. "She was your queen," Cordelia said quietly. He did not ask how she knew. "Yes." Cordelia looked down at the ring. "The woman I saw, her name was Elsin." The name lay between them like a prayer spoken too late. Rain hissed against the narrow panes. Lucian shifted and nestled deeper into the folds of her skirt. After a long silence, Cordelia said, "Was she of my bloodline?" "Yes." The answer made the room seem smaller. Valerian's voice remained level, but she heard old ruin beneath it. "Elsin was the last acknowledged daughter of House Marrow. The council permitted our union because it strengthened the old peace between mortal keepers and the Night Crown. When factions rose against that peace, they murdered her before she could name the traitors she had seen in memory. Cordelia closed her hand around the ring until the metal bit her skin. And now they fear Lucian because he might remember what she died knowing. Yes, she thought of her son's tiny body racked by fever. Of men in council robes, discussing whether he should live long enough to speak. Why did my mother hide? She asked. Because after Elson's death, all surviving Marrow kin were hunted, some by vampires, some by men who claimed to hate vampires and yet coveted the same power. Your mother vanished into a mortal marriage and changed her name twice. She survived by being forgotten. Cordelia looked at him. And you? A pause. Then, I survived by remembering. The words entered her like winter entering an abandoned church. He had not saved her out of sudden whim. He had done it because once, long ago, he had failed to keep another woman of her blood alive. All his cold authority, all his relentless control, perhaps it had been built around that one old absence. Lucian made a small, hungry sound. Cordelia adjusted him, but the movement drew a wince she could not hide. The silvered mark on her wrist had been aching all evening. Valerian saw it at once. The scar burns? Yes. He came closer, slowly enough to let her step back if she wished. She did not. May I? The courtesy of the question startled her more than the distance between them. She extended her hand. His fingers closed around her wrist with grave care. The touch was light, almost formal, yet heat moved through her pulse in a way that frightened her for reasons unrelated to danger. Valerian traced the edge of the silver crescents with his thumb, and the ache lessened at once. Cordelia drew a breath. He seemed to hear it. His gaze lifted to her face. In the firelight, the darkness of his eyes had gone almost tender, not with softness, but with the terrible concentration of a man holding himself back from an edge no one else could see. Then footsteps thundered in the corridor. The door burst open. One of the guards dropped to one knee, breathless. Your Majesty, forgive the intrusion. The western gate has been breached. Valerian released Cordelia at once. By whom? The guard swallowed. Not the council. Hunters? For the first time since Cordelia had known him, naked fury crossed the king's face. He turned toward the door, then stopped and looked back at her. There was no room left for court formality in his expression now. Only command, only fear sharpened into purpose. Bar this chamber after me, he said. If anyone but Ianth comes, do not open it. If the walls begin to whisper, cover the child's ears and pray to no god that answers quickly. And then he was gone. Cordelia stood frozen, Lucian in her arms, the ring burning in her palm. Outside, the palace bells began to ring for war. The truth of Valerian's dead queen had barely surfaced when vampire hunters breached Blackthorn's gates, proving the threat against Lucian was no longer hidden. It had come to the king's own door. The walls did whisper. At first Cordelia thought it was the rain in the mortar, the old tower settling under storm. Then words began to form, thin, coaxing, almost maternal. Cordelia, open the door. He will feed on the child before dawn. Lucian woke crying. Cordelia crossed herself on instinct, though she no longer knew which heaven governed a house like this. She wrapped the baby tighter, backed into the corner farthest from the door, and kept her gaze fixed on the silver bolt Valerian had ordered her to bar. The whispering moved through the stone like fingers under skin. Then it stopped. A great hush fell over the tower, so sudden and complete that she heard her own heart beating. The door opened. Valerian entered carrying blood on his sleeve. Not his own. Too bright, Cordelia's breath caught. Are you hurt? No, the lie was nearly flawless. Only the slight tension at his mouth betrayed it. He crossed the room, went to one knee before Lucian, and touched 2 fingers to the child's brow. Whatever he felt there made his face close further. The hunters were not after the gates, he said. They were testing the wards. How could they know where we were? He looked toward the walls. Because someone inside Blackthorn is speaking for them. That should have shocked her more than it did. By now betrayal seemed to breed naturally anywhere power collected. Valerian rose and moved to the hearth. Rainwater darkened the hem of his coat. On the back of his hand, a gash ran from knuckle to wrist, half-healed, then reopening as if the flesh itself could not decide whether to endure. Without thinking, Cordelia said, "Sit down." He turned. The king of the Night Dominion was not a man accustomed to being instructed. Yet perhaps the command had passed her lips so entirely from habit. Something once said to sick husbands, frightened children, the exhausted poor, that it held no insolence in it. Only plain human concern. Valerian looked at her for a long moment. Then, to her astonishment, he sat. Cordelia laid Lucian in the bassinet and fetched water, clean linen, and the small knife used to trim lampwicks. Her hands were steady now. Fear had burned itself clean into purpose. "This will need opening," she said softly, looking at the half-healed wound. "It is sealed over dirt." Valerian's mouth moved by an inch. "You intend surgery. I intend to keep it from turning black." He offered his hand without further protest. She cleaned the blade in the fire, waited, and then reopened the gash with careful precision. Dark blood welled. Valerian did not flinch. Neither did she, though the sight of his blood still felt strange, too dark, almost lustrous, as though night had been given liquid form. When she pressed clean linen to the wound, a pulse of warmth ran up her arm. The room changed, not outwardly, inwardly. Memory struck her with the violence of weather. She was no longer in the tower room. She stood in snow, seeing through no eyes she recognized. Men burned beneath winter trees. A younger Valerian, crowned and terrible, rode through smoke with grief sharpened into slaughter. Then another shift, Elson in white, alive this time, placing her hand over his and saying, "If I die, do not let them turn sorrow into law." The memory fractured again, a hall of council. The face of one kneeling lord, his eyes lowered in false loyalty, a ring on his hand shaped like a hooked raven's beak. Cordelia gasped and drew back. Valerian's head snapped up. "What did you see?" She was shaking. "A council chamber, after your queen died. One of them knelt before you." "Which one?" He wore a ring, black iron, curved like a beak. For the first time, something colder than anger entered Valerian's expression. "Severin, the chancellor?" "Yes," Cordelia stared. "He helped kill her. He helped bury the names of those who did." The room went silent except for Lucian's soft breathing. Valerian closed his hand slowly over the bandage she had tied. "This is blood memory. It wakes more easily between those already marked." Already marked. She looked down at the silver scar on her wrist, then up at him. "So every time your blood touches mine, something hidden may answer." She thought of how often he had restrained touch itself. How carefully he kept distance, except when necessity stripped him of choice. "Not indifference, then, discipline. Why not tell me all of this at once?" she asked. His gaze held hers. "Because grief explained too quickly begins to sound like strategy." That answer hurt in its truth. Lucian stirred, then reached a tiny hand out over the edge of the bassinet toward Valerian. The king stood at once and went to him. Again, that same impossible gentleness entered his movements. Cordelia watched his pale hand cover the child's chest for a heartbeat, reassuring himself of breath. The sight altered something inside her, subtly, irreversibly, not because it made him safe. Because it revealed the shape of his danger, not hunger, attachment. A brief darkness within him, Valerian had ruled empires, buried queens, condemned traitors, and outlived the warmth of his own name in mortal mouths. None of it had shaken him like the sight of Cordelia, kneeling over his wounded hand, with lamplight in her hair and fear for him, hidden inside practical mercy. He had told himself the claim in the cathedral was duty. Then why had her voice saying sit down felt more perilous than open war? He turned from the thought at once, as men turn from cliffs in fog. Back to Cordelia a knock came. Mistress Ianthe entered, pale with urgency. "Your Majesty, Chancellor Severin has invoked trial rights. He demands the widow appear before council at moonrise." Cordelia's throat tightened. Valerian did not look away from Lucian. "Tell him," he said, "that if he wishes to see her, he may kneel first where my queen bled." Mistress Ianthe did not move. "He brings scripture and witnesses. He means to make this public." At that, Valerian lifted his head. What Cordelia saw in his face then was not rage, it was decision. He turned to her at last and said, with grave inevitability, Then tonight, they will learn what I am willing to destroy for you. Blood Memory had named the Chancellor as part of the old betrayal, and now the council was forcing Cordelia into public trial, where Valerian intended to reveal just how far his protection would go. The council chamber beneath Blackthorn was older than the palace above it. Its walls had been cut from bedrock and polished until they reflected torchlight like dark water. 12 stone seats ringed the floor. Above them, no ceiling could be seen, only ribs of black arch vanishing into shadow. At the chamber's center stood a circular dais marked in silver lines that braided into ancient law. Cordelia entered with Lucian in her arms and felt those lines tug at the blood scar on her wrist. Severin waited beside the dais. He was not what terror had taught her to expect, not monstrous, not elegantly cruel. Merely composed, silver-haired, scholarly, wearing grief-colored robes clasped with iron at the throat. Yet perhaps that was worse. Men who resembled reason had often done the deepest harm. Valerian walked at her side, one step nearer to her than protocol permitted. Everyone in the chamber noticed. A murmur moved through the assembled lords and ladies of the night court. Some watched with fascination, others with open alarm. None looked at Cordelia as though she were ordinary. Severin bowed shallowly. "Your Majesty, Widow Vale." His eyes lingered on Lucian. Not tenderness, calculation. Cordelia tightened her hold. The chamber doors sealed. A priest of the Old Covenant stepped forward and struck the floor once with a staff of pale wood. "This hearing is convened under moon law," he intoned. The matter, unlawful concealment of memory blood, endangerment of the Night Dominion, and the king's invocation of the Ninth Covenant absent council witness. "I invoked it lawfully," said Valerian. Severin folded his hands. "That remains disputed. You dispute because the child did not wake in your custody." The Chancellor's expression did not flicker. "I dispute because sacred inheritances belong to the realm, not to private sentiment." Something in Cordelia went cold. Private sentiment, as if her son were an archive to be inventoried. As if a mother's body and a baby's life could be converted into terms neat enough to file. The priest gestured toward the silver-marked dais. "The widow must stand within the circle and answer." Valerian said, "No." The word struck stone like steel. The priest faltered. No one contradicted a king lightly inside law chambers. Yet Severin inclined his head and said, "If she remains beyond testimony, suspicion deepens." Cordelia felt every gaze gather on her. She could refuse. Valerian had already done so for her. But Lucian made a small, restless sound, and she knew with a terrible clarity, that nothing would end unless someone endured it. She shifted her son more securely and stepped forward. Valerian's hand closed around her elbow. The contact was not painful. It was worse. It carried every unsaid warning he had withheld since the cathedral. "You need not," he said quietly. Cordelia looked up at him. "You cannot fight all of them with silence." His gaze searched her face. Then, very slowly, he released her. She entered the silver circle. At once the scar on her wrist burned white-hot. Cordelia nearly cried out but bit it back. The priest began formal questions. Her mother's name, the date of her marriage, whether she knew the origin of the bloodline she carried, whether she had ever heard voices from the dead, seen visions, or hidden any item marked with House Marrow's crest. She answered truthfully. "No, not until now. No, yes, a ring." At that last word, Severin lifted his head. "Where is the ring?" Cordelia hesitated. Valerian's face became absolute stillness. "In my chamber," she said. A lie, the ring lay hidden in Lucian's blankets. The silver lines at her feet flashed. Pain lanced through her scar. Cordelia gasped. Severin smiled faintly. "The law detects falsehood." Before the priest could speak, Lucian began to cry. A sharp, unnatural cry, too shrill, too old for an infant throat. The torches guttered. Cordelia turned in horror as silver light rose under Lucian's skin, threading his tiny veins like molten moonlight. The chamber filled with whispering voices, too many to separate, names layered over names. The court recoiled. Blood memory had awakened in full. Lucian's eyes opened. For one impossible second, they were not an infant's cloudy gray but bright, ancient silver, and from his small mouth came a woman's voice. Severin knelt in blood and called it order. The chamber exploded into sound. Severin stepped back, true fear at last breaking through his poise. "Silence the child!" Cordelia lurched toward her son, but the silver lines around her feet flared higher, holding her in place. Valerian moved. Power struck the chamber like a storm front. The silver law lines shattered beneath his step, as if law itself had remembered who wore the crown before councils learned to name conditions. He took Lucian from the stunned guard who had instinctively tried to seize him, and the infant's cries stopped the moment the king's hand touched him. The chamber went breathless. Valerian turned, child in arms, and fixed his gaze on Severin. "You wanted witness," he said. His voice was very quiet. The chancellor backed away. "The blood speaks madness." "It cannot be admitted. It spoke your name." Severin's composure broke. "It spoke the ghost of a dead queen trained to hate me. And yet," said Valerian, "you tremble like a guilty man." Guards shifted at the edges of the chamber. Allegiances cracked in silence. Then one of the council women rose abruptly and pointed toward Cordelia. "The mother anchors the memory. Kill her and the line breaks." Everything after that happened at once. A blade flashed from somewhere in the gallery. Valerian turned too late to block its path toward Cordelia. She saw only a streak of black iron and the king moving with impossible speed, but not enough. The knife struck her beneath the ribs. The pain came as shock, not fire. She looked down in disbelief at the hilt protruding from her gown. Lucian screamed. Valerian's face changed. Not into monstrosity, into something infinitely worse, grief with no restraint left to cage it. The chamber lights shattered. Darkness dropped like a curtain. And in it, Cordelia felt the king's arms catch her before she hit the stone. Before the entire court, Lucian's awakened blood named Severin a traitor, and in the chaos, Cordelia was stabbed, leaving her life in Valerian's hands. Cordelia woke to rain. Not on her skin, but against high windows somewhere above. The sound drifted through darkness, threaded with candlelight. For a few disoriented moments, she knew only pain and softness and the heavy pull in her side where the knife had gone in. Then memory returned. Trial. Lucian's voice not his own. Severin named. The blade. She opened her eyes. She lay in a narrow bed draped with black gauze in a chamber she did not know. Stone walls, silver candles, a single cruciform window spilling stormlight across the floor. An old sanctuary room, perhaps, hidden somewhere inside the palace. Lucian slept in a cradle beside the hearth, and Valerian sat in a chair at her bedside as if he had never moved. His coat was gone. His shirt sleeves were rolled past the forearms, exposing pale skin marked by old scars so thin they looked like faded script. One hand rested open on his knee. The other was bandaged from wrist to palm. He watched her with a stillness so complete that for one impossible instant, she wondered if she were seeing a monument carved in grief. Then he said, "Do not try to rise." His voice was roughened, not with hunger but with exhaustion. Cordelia looked toward her side. Her gown had been changed for a linen shift. Over the bandaged wound, black symbols had been painted in a circle. "Did you heal me?" "Yes." "How?" A long pause. "With blood." She closed her eyes briefly. "Of course." He had warned her once that everything he did bound someone to him. Now she felt the truth of it inside her own pulse. Not domination, presence. A dark, steady current under her heartbeat, as if some part of his ancient silence had been placed within her merely to keep her alive. "You should have let me die," she asked, though she did not mean it as accusation, only wonder at the magnitude of the choice. Valerian's face hardened by an inch. No, such certainty, such refusal. When she opened her eyes again, he was looking at her wound, not her face. The blade was consecrated. It would have taken your heart by morning. And Lucian, safe, Severin, gone, fear sharpened her waking mind, escaped, for the hour. Cordelia let out a slow breath. Then this is not over. No, rain struck the window harder. The chamber felt sealed outside time, held between injury and whatever came next. Cordelia looked at him more closely. There were shadows beneath his eyes now, a drawnness to his mouth that made him seem suddenly less untouchable and far more dangerous. "You have not fed," she said quietly. His gaze snapped to hers. She had not meant to say it. Yet after the wound, after his blood had entered her, she could sense things she should not have been able to read. The strain in his body. The rigid control with which he held himself away from her bed. The hunger he would rather die than let frighten her. Valerian rose at once and moved toward the far wall. "Do not fear me," he said. It was the wrong instruction, not because she feared him too much, but because she feared him in the wrong way. "I am trying not to," Cordelia answered. He went still. She had never been a bold woman. Grief and necessity had carved reserve into her bones, yet pain stripped speech of ornament, and what remained was sometimes truer than courage. "I do not fear that you will harm me," she said softly. "I fear that I have begun to trust what I cannot survive losing." The room changed. Valerian turned back toward her very slowly, as though every motion required consent from some violent part of himself. His expression held nothing crude, nothing fevered. Only the grave astonishment of a man who had spent too long alone with duty and found, too late, that a single human sentence could undo him more effectively than war. He came to the bedside and stopped. "Cordelia!" It was the first time he had spoken her name like that, without title, without distance, without the shield of necessity. Her throat tightened. "I claimed you to keep you alive," he said. "I remained cold because your life is already too burdened by what I am. But when I saw you fall," he stopped. The unfinished words hurt more than confession. Cordelia looked down at her hands. "I thought I was only attached to your protection." A frightened woman may mistake shelter for devotion. "And now," she lifted her eyes to his, "now I know the difference." Silence opened between them, vast and trembling. Lucian slept on, one tiny fist curled under his chin, as if even in dreams he trusted the room to hold. Valerian's hand rose as though by instinct, then stopped in the air beside her face, waiting. Not taking, waiting, Cordelia did not move away. His fingers touched her cheek. It was the gentlest touch she had ever known, and precisely because of the restraint inside it, it undid her. She leaned into his hand before she could think better of it. Valerian closed his eyes once, briefly, as if the contact itself were a wound. Then he bent and kissed her, not with hunger unleashed. With sorrow, with reverence sharpened by long denial. The kiss was brief, almost unbearably careful, and when it ended his forehead remained against hers for a single heartbeat before he drew back. No more was needed, no more could be borne. At the cradle, Cordelia stirred and gave a soft sigh. Cordelia opened her eyes. "What happens now?" Valerian straightened, though some of that terrible new softness remained hidden in the lines of his mouth. "Now we stop running from the truth." A pounding sounded at the outer door. Mistress Ian's voice, urgent. "Your Majesty, the sanctuary wards are failing." "Someone has brought Severin to the lower crypts." Valerian's face became iron again. He looked once at Cordelia, once at Lucian, and the room filled with the shape of an oath not yet spoken aloud. Then he said, "Stay alive for me one more night," and left her with the taste of him still on her lips and dread rising like floodwater under the door. After saving Cordelia with his blood, and finally crossing the line between restraint and longing, Valerian learned Severin had returned to the palace crypts, where the failing wards suggested a final betrayal was already underway. The crypts beneath Blackthorn smelled of wet stone, incense, and old kings. Cordelia should not have been there. Her wound had only just ceased bleeding, and Mistress Ian had forbidden her even the chapel stairs. Yet when the sanctuary doors shook with distant impact, and Lucian woke wailing with the silverlight sickness again, obedience became impossible. She wrapped him close, concealed the ring within his blanket, and followed the pulse she felt through the blood bond, faint, insistent, leading downward through the palace, like a thread drawn through dark cloth. No guard stopped her. Either chaos had outrun command, or fate had. At the base of the final stair, she found the royal crypt chapel lit by guttering lamps. Effigies of dead monarchs lay on stone tombs with swords across their chests, their marble faces lifted toward a ceiling painted with a moon eclipsed in red. Valerian stood at the altar. Severin knelt before him, bound in chains blackened with consecration. Blood darkened one side of the chancellor's face. Around them lay the bodies of 2 hunters and 1 palace guard. Cordelia stopped in the shadows. She meant to remain unseen, but Lucian made a small sound and both men turned. Severin smiled through split lips. There she is. The last little archive. Valerian's expression sharpened with immediate fury. You were told to remain above. I know, Cordelia said, but he wanted me here. Severin's smile widened. At last the mother understands. Cordelia stepped closer, though her wound protested. Why? The chained chancellor looked almost pleased to explain. Because memory alone does not condemn. It requires acknowledgement, a living heir, a willing witness. The old Marrow line was designed that way to prevent kings from using dead voices as instruments. Valerian said, Enough! But Cordelia understood now. That is why you feared not only Lucian's blood, but mine. Severin inclined his head. Precisely, the child remembers, the mother confirms. Together, they could unmake every lie built since Elson's death. Cordelia felt the ring burning through Lucian's blanket. You killed her. I preserved the throne. Valerian crossed the distance between them and would have taken Severin's head with one bare hand had Cordelia not spoken first. No, the word echoed. Valerian froze. She did not go to him. She went to the altar instead and stood where Elson's name had been carved into white stone beside a royal seal cracked down the center. She told you not to turn sorrow into law, Cordelia said. Severin's face changed. The line had struck true. Valerian stared at her. You saw that? Yes. Lucian woke fully then and began to cry, not in fear this time, but with gathering force, as if some pressure inside him sought release. Silver light threaded his veins. The crypt lamps flared. Whispers filled the air. Cordelia nearly staggered. Valerian was at her side in an instant, one arm bracing her without claiming her weight. Do not let go of him. I won't. The ring, she drew it out. At once the whispering sharpened into distinct words, names, dates, places. Severin lunged against his chains as though he could still stop it. Break the child's neck. No one moved. Every guard in the crypt had gone white. Cordelia slid the ring onto her own finger. The metal tightened, warm as living skin. Then the crypt opened within her, not stone, not physically, in memory. She saw Elson standing in this very place, blood at her throat, naming the men who had sold access to the Marrow bloodline, who had invited hunters across the borders, who had hidden treason beneath the language of order. Severin among them, others too dead now, but their sons and sworn retainers still seated in council. Cordelia spoke the names aloud. Each one struck the crypt like a bell. Severin's composure broke into naked terror. Valerian did not look at him. He looked only at Cordelia, and in his face she saw not triumph, but something deeper and far more dangerous. Awe threaded with love he no longer wished to disguise. When the final name left her lips, the whispering ceased. Lucian sagged in her arms, merely a baby again. The crypt went silent. Then Valerian knelt, not before the altar, before her. Shock rippled through every witness present. He bowed his head, not as king, but as a man making himself answerable. Under crown and blood, he said, voice low and resonant in the dead king's chamber, I ask what law cannot compel. Will you acknowledge the bond freely, Cordelia Vale, not as ward, not as possession? As chosen covenant, her breath caught, no one had ever offered her choice at the center of power before, not the tribunal, not the court, not grief itself. Lucian slept against her shoulder. Cordelia looked at Valerian, at the stillness that hid hunger, at the authority bent now into humility, at the ancient sorrow that had not made him cruel. Yes, she whispered. And the moment the word left her mouth, the tomb beneath Elson's effigy cracked open. From the darkness below came the sound of wings. Cordelia freely accepted the bond Valerian had refused to force, but the acknowledgement shattered an ancient seal beneath the crypt, unleashing something long buried under Elson's tomb. The stone broke inward with a roar. Blackness rushed from the open tomb not like smoke, but like a living flock, shapes of wing and shadow and old, starving intelligence. Guards cried out. Two were flung against the crypt walls before steel could clear sheaths. Lamps burst one by one, scattering the chamber into strobe-lit dark. Valerian rose in a single movement and drew Cordelia behind him. "Take the child and go," he said. She clutched Lucian closer. "What is it?" His eyes were fixed on the swarm boiling above Elson's shattered effigy. "The first hunger sealed beneath royal graves, a thing bred from slaughter before the covenants gave us law." Severin meant to break the tomb if his name was spoken. Severin laughed through blood. "If I could not preserve your order, I would return you to what you were." One of the shadows struck the chain around his throat. The Chancellor's scream ended abruptly. The thing consumed him so completely that nothing remained but the fallen links. Cordelia did not scream. She had gone beyond screaming. Valerian turned half toward her. "Listen to me. The bond is not complete. If this reaches the upper halls, everyone living in Blackthorn dies. Then we stop it." His mouth tightened. "I stop it." The correction should have stung. Instead, it revealed fear. Not for himself, for her. The shadows wheeled lower. Their movement carried whispers older than speech. Lucian woke and cried, and silver light flashed beneath his skin once more. At once the swarm turned, toward the child. Valerian moved with terrifying force, one hand lifting toward the crypt vault. The shadows slammed backward as if struck by invisible iron. Stone cracked, dust rained from the arches. For one instant he held the entire dark mass at bay through will alone. But Cordelia saw the strain in him. The old hunger knew him. It pressed against his power like a beast against a thinning door. "Cordelia," he said without looking at her, voice sharpened by effort. "There is a passage behind Elson's tomb. Take Lucian and run to the river gate. Ianth will—" "No." The word left her before fear could stop it. Valerian's head turned a fraction. The shadows shrieked against his restraint. "You cannot hold that alone," she said. "And if I flee now, it will follow Lucian wherever I take him. It will follow him anyway. Then let it follow him through us, not past us." Something broke across his expression then, not anger. Not command. A terrible understanding that she had reached the same conclusion he had. The altar behind them trembled. Lucian's crying rose into that impossible silver-lit wail, and at once the ring on Cordelia's finger burned so fiercely she nearly dropped him. Memory surged through her, broken images, but enough. A king kneeling at this same tomb centuries ago. A queen's blood on the seal. A vow spoken not to imprison the first hunger, but to bind it beneath choice. Choose the hand that shields, not the hand that owns. It had never been a warning only for her mother, it was instruction. "Valerian," she whispered. He heard something in her voice and turned fully now, though the shadows clawed at the edges of his control. "What is it?" The seal was not made by force. His face went still. Cordelia looked toward the shattered tomb and knew, with that dreadful calm blood memory sometimes brought, that Elson had stood where she stood now. Not to obey, to choose. "It answers covenant," she said. "Not domination, not command, it was bound by a willing witness." The swarm surged. Valerian's restraint faltered. One spear of darkness tore free and struck his shoulder, driving him to one knee. Black blood spotted the crypt floor. Cordelia's breath caught. Lucian cried harder. "Go!" Valerian roared. But she was already moving. She crossed the crypt in 2 unsteady strides and knelt beside him. Child in one arm, free hand, catching his face just once as if to make him remain in the world long enough to hear her. His skin was cold. His eyes, for the first time, showed the edge beneath all his control, the abyssal hunger he had spent centuries mastering. "Do not shut me out," she said. "Cordelia, if this must be chosen, then let me choose it." The dark mass above the tomb writhed, listening. Valerian stared at her, as though the sight of her kneeling before him in the crypt of dead kings had become more unbearable than death itself. "You do not understand what you offer. I understand enough. No, if you complete the covenant willingly, the hunger may mark you through me." My enemies would never be able to separate what you are from what I am. Your life will never return to you unchanged. She thought of the tribunal chain, of her sail, of Lucian's cradle nearly taken by things that wore law, hunger, and righteousness in turns. There is nothing to return to, she said quietly. Only forward. The words struck him silent. Lucian whimpered, reaching blindly between them. Cordelia shifted the child so that Valerian could place one bloodied hand over Lucian's small heart. Then she covered Valerian's hand with hers. At once the ring blazed. The crypt dissolved into memory and moonlight. She saw Elson again, not dying now, but standing alive before this same abyss, her hand in Valerian's, saying, not by fear, by promise. She saw the first covenant carved in blood and grief, royal restraint tethered to mortal witness, so that the oldest hunger could never again wear a crown unchallenged by the living. Cordelia came back to herself with tears on her face. The seal needs 3, she said, breathless. The ruler, the witness, the inheritor. Valerian understood. His face became very calm. That frightened her more than anything. No, she said at once, hearing the decision before he spoke it. It will take blood enough to close, he said. Lucian is a child, you are wounded. Therefore, no, Cordelia, you do not get to choose sacrifice alone. The shadows plunged. Valerian turned and met them head-on. Darkness swallowed half his body. The crypt shook with a sound like 1,000 starved mouths opening at once. Cordelia saw what he meant to do then, not seal it with covenant, feed it himself. Drag the first hunger back into the tomb through the force of royal blood, and let the grave keep king and beast together. She rose despite the wound tearing fresh under her bandages. Valerian, he looked back once. In that one glance she saw farewell. Cordelia drew the small lamp knife from her sleeve, cut her palm, and pressed her bleeding hand to the broken seal above Elson's tomb. I choose, she cried. Everything stopped. The shadows froze in mid-flight. Valerian went rigid, horror flashing across his face, not because she had bled, but because the crypt had answered her. The seal drank her blood. Then Lucian's silverlit cry turned suddenly into stillness, and a voice, not his, not hers, but old as memory, spoke through the crypt stone. The witness has chosen. The crown must answer. And beneath Cordelia's bloodied hand, the tomb opened wider. To prevent Valerian from sacrificing himself, Cordelia invoked the ancient covenant with her own blood, forcing the broken tomb to demand a final answer from the king, the mother, and the child together. For one suspended instant, no one in the crypt breathed. The shattered tomb glowed from within, not with fire, but with a deep silver radiance like moonlight seen through water. The first hunger hung motionless above it, caught between descent and devouring. Its countless shadowings trembled around the edges of the light, as though ancient rage had finally met a law older than violence. Cordelia's palm burned against the seal. Blood slid through the carved channels beneath her hand, threading outward in a pattern she knew without knowing how. Crown, witness, inheritor. 3 lines meeting in one circle. Valerian stood inside the halted storm, black blood on his shoulder. Darkness coiling around his body like something that recognized its first home in him. When he looked at her now, she saw no throne in his face, only fear and love stripped of every last disguise. Take your hand away, he said. His voice was low, almost breaking beneath restraint. Cordelia shook her head. If you do this, he said, the covenant will name you before every living and dead thing bound to the night crown. They will know what you are to me. She thought of the title given to her at the tribunal, debt, widow, lot for sale. She thought of the word he had used instead, mine to protect. And now, after all that had passed, she knew the difference between being claimed and being chosen. Then let them know, she said. The crypt answered with a peal of sound like a bell struck under the earth. Lucian woke in her other arm, but he did not cry. His eyes opened silver-clear once more, and he looked from his mother to the king with solemn, impossible calm. Valerian closed his eyes briefly. Then he came to her, not hurriedly, not as though overtaken by frenzy, with that terrible, grave certainty that had marked every true thing he had done since entering the tribunal hall. He placed his uninjured hand over hers on the seal. At once the silver lines in the tomb flared upward, encircling them both. The first hunger shrieked. Cordelia felt the covenant open through her body. Not pain exactly, though it hurt. More like every hidden chamber of her life being forced wide to admit memory, grief, and choice all at once. She saw Elias smiling over Lucian's cradle, her mother hiding the black-silver ring with shaking hands, Elson in white, turning to face death so that truth might outlive her. And beneath all of it, she felt Valerian, not his thoughts but the structure of him. Centuries of restraint, sorrow held so long it had become nobility. Hunger mastered not because he lacked darkness, but because he refused to let darkness choose for him. Tears blurred her sight. Lucian lifted one tiny hand and touched the seal between theirs. The third line ignited, the covenant completed, light erupted from the tomb. The first hunger convulsed, all its shadowed bodies resolving at once into what it had always been. Not a creature, but the oldest appetite of the Night Crown, the brutal will to take without witness. To feed without law, to make grief into dominion. Bound once by a queen and a king, it had waited in burial for cowardice to free it. Now it met something stronger, not force, consent. The light folded inward, taking the shrieking darkness with it. The swarm collapsed like burned paper. Shadows recoiled into the opened grave, drawn by the very oath they had been made to obey. The stone seal began to reform over them, but not fast enough. A final spear of darkness tore free and flew straight for Lucian. Cordelia moved on instinct, twisting to shield him. So did Valerian. The shadow struck Valerian across the chest. He staggered. For the first time since Cordelia had known him, his knees gave. The tomb sealed with a thunderous finality. Silence crashed through the crypt. Cordelia caught Valerian as he fell. The weight of him was terrible and human, and far too still. She sank to the crypt floor with him half against her, Lucian pressed safe between her side and the altar stone. Valerian's face had gone bloodless, even by vampire standards. Beneath his shirt, the wound over his heart spread outward in threads of black, as though the dying hunger had tried to root itself in the oldest darkness it knew. "No," she whispered. He opened his eyes, barely. "It is done," he said. "I did not ask whether it was done." Her voice shook for the first time. "I asked for you." Around them, guards and household retainers had begun to gather at the crypt entrance, but none dared come too close. Even Mistress Ian stopped a respectful distance away, one hand over her mouth. Valerian looked at Lucian first, as if checking the child's breath mattered more than his own. Then his gaze returned to Cordelia. There was apology in it. That was what undid her. "You do not leave me with an apology," she said, tears falling now without ceremony. "Not after dragging me from a tribunal, not after putting your blood into my son and into me. Not after making me trust you enough to survive." Something like pain and something like wonder touched his eyes. Cordelia remembered then what the covenant had revealed: ruler, witness, inheritor, not sacrifice, union. Her own pulse answered the dark current under her skin. Without hesitation, she drew the lamp knife once more across her wrist, reopening the silvered scar. Mistress Ian inhaled sharply. Someone in the crypt whispered her name in warning. Cordelia ignored them all. She lifted Valerian's head into the cradle of her arm and pressed her bleeding wrist to his mouth. At once his whole body went rigid. "No," he said, though the word was barely sound. "You taught me the difference between being kept and being chosen," she whispered. "Choose me back." His eyes shut. For one dreadful moment she thought he would refuse and die of it. Then, with a restraint so fierce it felt like reverence, Valerian took her blood. Not greedily, not as hunger triumphant, as vow. The bond in her body blazed alive. Heat swept through him beneath her hands. The black web over his chest shuddered, cracked, and began to recede like frost under dawn. When he finally released her wrist, he did so gently enough to make her weep harder. The wound closed under a thin silver mark that mirrored his. Valerian drew one unsteady breath, then another. Around them, the crypt had gone utterly silent. He looked at the scar on her wrist, at the matching mark over his own hand, and understood what every witness in the chamber understood. The covenant had not merely sealed, it had named. A brief darkness within him he had once believed love was the one law death always broke. Yet here she was, mortal, wounded, trembling with his blood in her veins and hers in his mouth. Looking at him, not with fear, but with the grave sorrow of one who had chosen a dangerous life knowingly. Kings were not often given mercy. He received it from her as if it were sacrament. Back to Cordelia, Valerian rose slowly, then held out his hand. Cordelia placed her hand in his and let him lift her. Lucian had fallen asleep again, safe in Mistress Ian's astonished arms. The child's skin held no more silver fever, only warmth. The king turned to the witnesses crowding the crypt. His voice, when it came, carried through stone and blood and the remnant hush of buried hunger. "Let it be known," he said, "that Cordelia Vale stands under no man's ownership, no council's claim, and no debt of mortal law. She is acknowledged by crown and covenant as the chosen witness of Blackthorn, and Lucian Vale as the living heir of Memory Blood under royal protection." He paused. Then more quietly, though somehow the words struck deeper, "And she is beloved of the throne." No one spoke against it. No one could. Winter passed. Blackthorn Palace did not become gentle, but it became less haunted by silence. Traitors named through the marrow memory were stripped of office or fled before judgment. The hunter cells that had fed on hidden alliances were rooted out one by one. Lucian grew from a fragile infant into a solemn child with gray eyes that sometimes went silver in candlelight when old names were spoken, though never again with pain. Cordelia did not become a creature of the night. The covenant had changed her less crudely and more completely than that. Time moved strangely around the scars she and Valerian shared. She remained mortal, yet not untouched. Her life had become braided to a dark kingdom, and the man who ruled it with more restraint than power had ever before known. Some nights she still woke fearing the cathedral, the silver chain, the auctioneer's voice. On those nights Valerian would say nothing at first. He would simply sit beside the bed or stand at the window, giving her the dignity of recovering without witness if she wished it. Only when she reached for him would he come near. And always he waited to be chosen. Years later, when people told the story in whispers, they told it wrongly in 100 ways. They said a widow had been seized by a vampire king. They said a child had opened a grave. They said a throne had claimed what debt had already sold. But the truest version lived not in rumor, nor in law, nor in blood archives buried beneath stone. It lived in the quiet fact that on the night the oldest hunger returned, the king did not save her by possessing her. He saved her by kneeling, and she saved him by staying. Their bond was not born from ownership, but from mutual choice, turning a public claim made in humiliation into an eternal covenant freely answered by love.